do on this book.
This meeting is being recorded.
And I said, yes. And so I really want to start with a story and then kind of weave that into my introduction to the book. So as I started to read the book, I recalled this incident where several years ago I was on vacation and I did something that I love to do when I have the time, which is that I walked into a bookstore just to spend some quiet time perusing. And of course, I went to the Judaica section, which I often do, just to see if there's anything new and interesting out in Jewish literature. And then as I'm standing there looking at the titles, something unnerved me. And it was that I suddenly realized that over 60% of the books that were on the shelf were about the Holocaust or were related somehow to the Holocaust. So perhaps in and of this self, this shouldn't be unnerving, but, and you know, I did my undergraduate thesis on the literature written by women survivors of the Holocaust. I had the privilege of studying with Elie Wiesel in college. Wow. So, but there was something about the number of books on the shelf in the Judaica section because this incident happened on the heels of the Pew Jewish population study that came out. And in the Pew population study, it said that more Jews said that remembering the Holocaust is essential to their Jewish identity than leading a moral and ethical life. So 76% of Jews said that remembering the Holocaust was the most essential part of their Jewish identity. And 72% said leading a moral and ethical life. And by the way, going down, you know, the rank, continuing Jewish family traditions was 51%. So really the highest ranking factor was remembering the Holocaust, which I thought was worrisome to me, that should be the biggest factor. And so the question that I ask and the question that Dara Horn asks in the book is, why are we and the world so obsessed with dead Jews, right? What is it about that? And the author, Dara Horn, says that she mistook this enormous public interest in Jewish suffering for a sign of respect for Jewish living Jews, for people who were living Jews, right? That the reason why people were so interested in past Jewish suffering was because they respected living Jews. And in the book, she says she was wrong. And that's the introduction to the book. So on the screen here, other than Kathy and myself, did anybody else read the book?
I started the book.
Okay, great.
I started it. I'm a little late, you know, I was a little late to the game, but I did start it. So
okay, good. So Kathy or Shelby, even if you're just at the beginning, I'm just wondering if you had any surprises that you read or anything that really like grabbed you.
So again, I haven't finished the book, but even just the beginning when she relates the stories, you know, at the Anne Frank Museum, that was a huge eye opener for them, the Anne Frank Museum, for them to have a problem with a Jewish employee wearing his kippah, and also the tapes, right? The audio tapes for the tours did not have the Israeli flag.
The Israeli flag, yeah.
Right.
And it just, I mean, that's like having cold water like thrown on your face, I think, is, you know, what I think of it, because if they are not comfortable with us showing who we are, I mean, that's just so troubling, you know, like, and anyway, so that was an eye opener.
So that's actually what I'm going to start with, is talking about that. And I think for me, reading this book was kind of like you said, water being thrown on your face. It was like, I had so many aha moments reading the book where I was like, oh my gosh, like things that, because I kind of see the world mostly through rose-colored glasses. I, usually give people the benefit of the doubt, and I try to think the most positive thing possible. The book is pretty, like, I don't want to say sinister, but it's pretty jaded. And I think there's a lot of truth in it. But she, for those of you who haven't read the book, she opens by talking about an incident that happened at the Anne Frank house. How many of you have been there to the Anne Frank house?
We're going to be there in June.
Oh,
We
great.
we were supposed to be there in December, but Amsterdam got shut down, so we pivoted. But
so I think I've been there 3 times. I mean, it's a very powerful experience. And one of the things that most moved me about the Anne Frank house was the basement level has the diary written, it's published in like so many different languages. And the basement level has every language that is published in on display, which really just struck me. Anyway, she tells a story about how there was an Orthodox Jewish employee, a man, who worked at the Anne Frank house and wore a kippah. And he was actually asked to put a baseball cap on to cover his kippah because they wanted the museum to appear neutral. And he objected to covering his kippah, and it took the museum 4 months to deliberate on whether or not he could identify by wearing a kippah. And Dara Horn, the author, this is what she says about that. She says, seems like a rather long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And so the irony of that incident and that statement and really provokes the question, why? Why was it that they wanted him to cover his head? And what is this whole idea of being neutral? Like, what was going on there? So, any thoughts about that?
I mean, where to start with that? I mean, to me, Jews have always been the scapegoat for everyone. And when, even now, Putin's going into Ukraine to denazify, and these poor Holocaust survivors that live there are reliving their trauma all over again. I think that we have been a scapegoat for generations. And I think part of the issue truthfully lies on us as Jews, that we don't stand up against the anti-Semitism enough. Even at the Miami Beach rally this past, I believe, spring, so many congregants were telling me, oh, we're not going, we're scared. We're scared to go against the to stand up against anti-Semitism. Well, if we're scared and if we are not standing up against it, then no one else is. And if no one else is telling the Anne Frank house, it's appalling what happened to this gentleman, but most of Europe is very anti-Jew. France, I remember in college going to France with my mom, and we walked out of the hotel and it says, we hate Jews, we hate Americans. It was right after 9/11. Somehow the Jews got thrown into 9/11. Literally the sign said, go home Jews, go home Americans. I'm like, what do Jews have to do with 9/11? It's like the constant bringing us into everything that negatively happens in the world.
So Eric Ward, when he was here, and I know you heard him, Shelby, talked a lot about that, about needing to be more vocal about standing up for ourselves. But What I'm particularly interested in here is why at the Anne Frank house did they want to hide someone's Jewish identity?
That's such a tough question. You know, I mean, the thing that comes in is the fear or trying to, I feel like it's all part of what Dara wrote about, is that we try to fit in. So we don't want to stand out, and we don't want to stand out as something other than the society as a whole. And which is, you know, that doing that really doesn't do any good at all. I mean, all the Germans, you know, all the German Jews, you know, look what happened to them, and they're good German citizens. And I feel like there's an element of fear there, you know. That's the only thing I can think of.
Norris, were you going to say something?
No, at this time, but
Okay, I saw you wanting to say something. So, you know, this was kind of one of the aha moments for me, is when she said, you know, one of the reasons why Anne's story is so venerated is because of the universal message that she transmits. You know, her famous quote is, "I still believe that in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart." And what Horn says is that this is the message of the Anne Frank house, and the particularistic message of the war against the Jews is not the message there, right? And then I want to read you directly from the book. I'm going to read from page 9, if any of you have the book in front of you. Okay, yeah, so she says, the line most often quoted from Frank's diary are her famous words, "I still believe in spite of everything that people are truly good at heart." These words are inspiring, by which we mean that they flatter us. They make us feel forgiven for those lapses of our civilization that allow for piles of murdered girls. And if those words came from a murdered girl, well, then we must be absolved because they must be true. The gift of grace and absolution from a murdered Jew is what millions of people are so eager to find in Frank's hiding place. In her writings is her legacy. It is far more gratifying to believe that an innocent dead girl has offered us grace than to recognize the obvious. Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart before meeting people who weren't. 3 weeks after writing these words, she met people who weren't. Here's how much some people dislike living Jews. They murdered 6 million of them. So this was really stunning to me, just this, you know, because I'm one of those people who's always venerated Anne Frank. And you know, I include some of her words at my Seder every year, and it is inspiring, right? But it's also true, she wrote all that before she was murdered by the Nazis. And that, you know, what Horn is saying is that people want to revere her because it gets them off the hook, because this victim still believed in the goodness of humanity. Right? So does that make sense to you? Do you agree with that thesis?
Sure. I mean, it makes sense to me, because the way society looks at things these days is, look at the good in everyone, look at the good, don't look at the bad, look at the good. And if they focus on, you know, if you go back to what happened in the Holocaust, if they focus on the negative, they focus on those 6 million, then to the Holocaust, to the Anne Frank house, then they're not what they believe teaching okay, maybe I'm like getting ahead of myself. Hold on. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the Anne Frank house is trying to stay neutral, because if you focus on the Jews, you're not going to, in general, I mean, you're not going to have that neutrality as a whole. When you focus on the Jews, nothing about the way society has looked at the Jews as a whole has been neutral by any means. So for the Anne Frank house to continue their legacy of Anne Frank, and I'm just like talking out loud, anyone can stop me, to continue her belief that, you know, there's good in everyone and everyone's got a good heart, then you have to steer the opposite direction of what actually transpired with the Jews during the Holocaust. I don't know, anyone can stop me. It's just.
Right, right. I mean, it's the story. I think that the reason why the story has been so widely translated and been so beloved is because it's the story of goodness and, you know, bravery and courage and beauty, right? And it's a naivete that
But
he
they-
has that is, you know, truly corrupted by what happened to her. So I guess, you know, what Dara Horn would say is that this gentleman wanting to wear his kippah kind of is regressive, right? Because it's a Jewish message instead of this universal message that they want the Anne Frank story to resonate with people.
Right, because if you bring in the Jewish story to it, it changes the whole dynamic.
Right.
The entire Anne Frank story.
Right. And, you know, the really, you know, it's such a heavy thing to even say, but it's like, yeah, they love her. She died. She died as this child. And if she had lived, she wouldn't be this famous person that she is, right? But because she died, she's no threat. You know, she's a dead Jew. And what Horn is saying is that dead Jews aren't threatening to people because they're dead. It's us living Jews who are the ones who are threatening. So it's a very icky thing to think about, but I think there's a lot of truth in it. Okay, so I want to move on to, I think I have 3 things I want to talk about. So that was the first one. There may be 4, I don't remember, but the next one is this discussion that she has about Jewish tourism in the book. I mean, there's a lot in the book. I just picked the ones that affected me the most, that were most like aha for me. And I was recently, here's another incident. I was recently at a bridal shower, and I was speaking to a woman who was talking about her, I believe it was Prague she was recently in. And she visited Prague and she signed up for, or her tour guide took them to visit all these Jewish sites in Prague. And she was really praising this guide for being so interested in these Jewish cultural spots. And I actually had just finished reading the book. I too am a person who, when I go abroad, I of course am interested. And I too, when I was in Prague, went to the cemetery and to the synagogues. And, you know, I'm always looking for the Jewish spots. But in the book, she talks about the way these sites are manipulated and exploited for economic purposes for the city or the country or even the guides, right? So in particular, she focuses on this one city in China that I had never heard of called Harbin. And it's billed as a Jewish heritage site, as opposed to, this is Dara Horn's expression, it could have been called, she says, property seized from dead or expelled Jews, right? So that's the cynical name in her mind. The Chinese are calling it a Jewish heritage site, but she says it could have more accurately been called property seized from dead or expelled Jews. So according to Horn, and you'll have to read the book to find out the whole history of Harbin, which is really fascinating. But the Chinese government put $30 million into restoring this site where Jews once lived. Not to tell the story, says Horn, but to benefit economically from the story. And in 2007, there was an international forum on economic cooperation and between Harbin and the world's Jews. Okay, it was hosted at Harbin. And many prominent Jews were invited to this gathering. And the mayor of Harbin welcomed them. And in doing so, he announced, quote unquote, the world's money is in the pockets of the Americans, and the Americans' money is in the pocket of the Jews. This is the highest acclaim and praise to Jewish wisdom. So he thought this was a compliment, right? That he was saying the Americans have the money, and of the Americans, it's the Jews who have the most money. And it's because they're so smart that they have all that money. So they figured that if they restored this site and called it a Jewish heritage site, they would be able to benefit economically from the story that was told. And I think I made myself a note that I wanted to look at pages 22 and 23 with you. So let me just see what's there that I wanted to read. Okay, you ready? It's middle of page 22 for those who have the book. There is a tourist industry concept popular in places largely devoid of Jews called Jewish heritage sites. The term is a truly ingenious piece of marketing. Jewish heritage is a phrase that sounds utterly benign, or to Jews, perhaps ever so slightly dutiful, suggesting a place that you surely ought to visit. After all, you came all this way, so how could you not? And here's what she said, this is a much better name than property seized from dead or expelled Jews. By calling these places Jewish heritage sites, all those pesky moral concerns about, say, why these sites exist to begin with, evaporate in the midst of goodwill. And not just goodwill, but goodwill aimed directly at you, the Jewish tourist. These non-Jewish citizens and their benevolent government have chosen to maintain this cemetery or renovate this synagogue or create this museum purely out of their profound respect for the Jews who once lived here and who, for unstated reasons, no longer do. And out of their sincere hope that you, the Jewish tourist, might someday arrive. But still, you cannot help but feel uncomfortable and finally helpless as you engage in the exact inverse of what Benjamin Tutela once did. Instead of traveling the world and visiting Jews, you are visiting their graves. So, what's your, for those of you who are Jewish tourists on the screen, how do you feel about this?
It's weird because whenever we go somewhere, we go to, like in Italy, we went to the ghetto, or in Rome, and I like to go to the places, where Jews used to live. But she really makes such a valid point, because they don't talk about what Jews have contributed anywhere. It's all like we're feeding into that by, I guess by going those places and not doing something to counterbalance it, I think.
I agree. I mean, when we were supposed to go to Amsterdam, we had a pivot and we went to Spain. We were in Portugal first, and with the children, we try to take them, to the Jewish areas. And in Sevilla, they took us to the first like Jewish ghetto, and it was all about the death. And this one particular woman that was hung because she tried to warn her family of, people coming to take the Jews and kill them and slaughter them. I mean, yeah, I agree. It does, it focuses on the negative.
I mean,
But
and
I also believe, I also believe
Good.
it focuses so much on that negative because there's so much ignorance about the Jewish history and culture. For instance, just tying this into like today's modern society, like what goes on today, like Whoopi Goldberg, what she said, people are like, isn't she an anti-Semite? I go, I don't look at her as an anti-Semite, because she made the comment that Jews are not a nationality, or whatever, she said Jews are not a nationality, they're a religion.
Yeah.
But that's ignorance. I think a lot of the world, there's a lot of ignorance about, sorry, everyone froze, so I don't know if you can hear me.
we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone's just frozen. But I think a lot of it, they focus on the negative because I think as a society, people are more interested in the negative, unfortunately. And I think there's a lot of ignorance when it comes to the Jewish people.
Well, even in the beginning of the book, when she was a teenager, I think, and went to this, was it debate? I think some tournament, and her roommates were two girls from the Midwest, and they were in
Mississippi or something.
Oh,
Yeah.
Mississippi, right? And when the conversation ended up being about Jesus or something, and when they found out she was Jewish, like one of the girls was incensed because she's blonde hair and blue eyed, and they said, you can't be Jewish, they're all dark, like Hitler said they were all dark. And I mean, I have friends, and I don't know if this happened to any of you, Shelby, you're probably too young, but like some of my college friends, one of my closest friends, when she moved into her dorm, like her roommate was from Alabama, and it was the mid 70s, and actually asked where her horns were, and you're right. It's just, some of it's ignorance, and some of it I think is not ignorance, some of it I think is just hate, or, and I don't like to be that cynical, but I think the facts are out there,
Yeah, I do think, it's curious, this whole interest in Jews. Is it voyeurism, looking at, the dead Jews, or is it true? Is it like the unicorn? Like, it's just so interesting. And I feel so ambivalently about this chapter about the tourist Jews, because I have been so much one of those people who has looked. And in fact, I just finished writing my article for the May HaKol, and I wrote it that my husband and I this summer on the way home from Israel are going to Berlin. And in my life, we never, ever thought we would go to Germany. We've never had a German car. Like, hearing the German language makes my skin crawl. But I feel like I want to witness, how, because what I've learned now that I'm a little bit more mature as an adult, is that of all the places in Europe, Germany has truly made restitution, done teshuvah, and their memorial is called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Right? There's no pussyfooting and no whitewashing. It's just exactly what it is. And I think that's kind of what Horn was saying in her chapter about Harbin, calling these places the world cultural sites and glossing over why the Jews are gone. That this memorial in Berlin actually just says it like it is, a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe.
I don't want to play devil's advocate to
Go
this,
ahead.
but yeah, she's writing from a point of view. And I think that you have to realize there's another side to this. I mean, don't we keep saying we should never forget? We want to know what happened, and we want everyone else to know what happened. And if it's going to be like what the blacks are doing now, oh, you can't teach it. You can't teach it in the schools. You shouldn't remember what happened to you, your people who are no longer here. Where did you come from? Look at what you are now, and don't look at that. And I think if we don't do the presentations of what did happen and leave it there, not only for the Jews to go. It's not, are Jews the only people who go to the Jewish Museum on South Beach? Is that who we want to come? No, we want everyone to come. And not necessarily to see how many people died, but to do see how many people died and why they died and how they died, and not to let it happen again.
But I think that there's a difference, Bobby, between, let's say, a Holocaust museum or Holocaust memorial and something like what you see in Harbin or maybe Prague or maybe Rome. Because a Holocaust museum generally particularly documents the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't think that falls into the same category of what she's talking about in her Jewish tourism, like exploiting the Jewish tourists. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's two sides to every story. I think you're right. But I think she's right too.
Oh, I do too. I do
Yeah.
too. I'm not saying no. I mean, I can't wait to get the book and read it. I really am very interested now in reading it and seeing that point of view.
Yeah.
And her point also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Kathy.
Is that it's like we end there and nobody talks about the accomplishments, like Gail was saying, in Harvey, they don't say why they left, or they don't talk about the accomplishments of the Jewish community there. And it's the same thing everywhere else. Like all these books about the Holocaust, like they're so popular, but but survivors, their books aren't quite so popular. And we just don't expound enough on our accomplishments, unless you subscribe to like the Jerusalem Post or Times of Israel or whatever, like you see the accomplishments of Israel and the accomplishments of, the Jewish people, but the general public doesn't see that. Like there's not an emphasis on our accomplishments. It's only, the fact that we died.
Because it's not woke.
Yeah.
I honestly feel that way. I think if we were a woke thing to be talked about and learned about, everyone would be all over it. It is not a cool thing to talk about Jews. It's not a cool thing to be pro-Israel. It's not a cool thing to be a Zionist. It's not a cool thing to call out anti-Semitism in this country or around the world. I mean, it's not woke. I think that's what it comes down to.
It's what's been playing in my mind since the war started in Ukraine is how Zelensky, who's become this kind of iconic figure around the world, how him being Jewish is that going to impact the way people see Jews at all? Or are they going to just classify him in a different category? Oh, he's different than the other Jews, right? I haven't read anything about it. I've just been thinking about that myself.
It's interesting you brought that up because I was thinking about it too. And then, I already see the news media focusing on the negative with him. All politicians, have their, I don't want to put all politicians in the same boat, but, they called out that he's a corrupt politician, which I don't know. I don't know. And I would have to do my own research, but they're already trying to find that negative with him. So I wonder too, a lot of people who I spoke to, a lot of my friends from home from growing up didn't even know he was Jewish, and that he was a grandchild of an only surviving family member who fought against the Nazis. And they, that information is not out there the way information about that he's a corrupt politician, that he has a Swiss bank account is. It's interesting what is put out in the media and what is kind of held back.
Where are you reading? Because I haven't read any of this.
Oh my God, where am I reading?
Because I'm, an old fogey, and I'm reading in the New York Times and, the Miami Herald, and you're probably reading online.
So I read a lot online, and what we like to do with the children, to be honest, is we want them to form their own political views. So we kind of do 30 minutes of CNN, 30 minutes of MSNBC, and 30 minutes of Fox. And between the three, it's very fascinating. The information you can pull, between the different, and what the kids, the older two, not my little 5-year-old, but the older two are able to pull from it. Jay Post, I follow a lot on Instagram with different anti-Semitism. There's this woman, Noah.
Noah Tishby.
Noah Tishby.
Yeah.
There's this other woman in Texas who I follow a lot. I forgot Liz. Forgot her name off the top of my head. But and then when I see the information, then I do the research if I'm really interested in it before, But it's interesting that what seems to be the focus of him. To me, regardless Jewish or not, what he's doing is amazing. I don't know if he's corrupt or not. I'm not here to judge that. I'm here to say he is being a pillar for his people, and he is giving them a reason to survive and succeed and to fight.
Yeah, I have really seen him universally venerated, but I'm not switching to Fox at all. but
we got Ari in the house, it's we
really?
Try to give, so with Ari, so we try to give them a little. I want my children
That's
to know.
a really good idea.
Occasionally during the elections we did that just to see what other people were saying, but yeah, I think the longer the war goes on, the more opportunity they'll have to tarnish his reputation.
Of course.
Yeah. All right, I want to move to the third piece of the book that was the aha piece for me, and that is about Ellis Island.
Oh.
Okay, so this is just gonna pull the floor out from under your feet. She says, Dara Horn says, that the whole notion of people's names being changed at Ellis Island is a myth. And that in 1932, over a decade after Ellis Island closed, that over 65% of name-changing petitions were filed by Jews with Jewish sounding, or by people with Jewish sounding names. And she goes into the whole, you have to read it for yourself, this whole business about how names were not changed at Ellis Island. And she asks the question, why was this myth created? Why did people create this myth that people's names were innocently changed in haste at Ellis Island? And she says it's because the Jews who went to America, thought it was going to be a place where they were going to be fully accepted, the Golden Medina, right? But they actually discovered that they were discriminated against in America, that they couldn't get jobs, that they were harassed. They didn't want to admit to themselves or to their children that it was their Jewish identity that was being discriminated against. And I'm going to read you a passage from the book. This is page 95. She's quoting this woman named Vermaglich, who says, Jews were uncomfortable talking about anti-Semitism and may have even been ashamed of their experiences with anti-Semitism, unquote. The difficulty these American Jewish families were facing had nothing to do with spelling or pronunciation, but none of them could admit it. And thus the process of hiding one's name became embedded within the more elaborate process of hiding the reasons why. This brings us to the reality behind the funny family stories of names that were changed at Ellis Island. The Ellis Island legend is simply the final step in this multi-generational process of denying, hiding, and burying the reality that American Jews feared most, namely the possibility that they were not welcome here. So in other words, it was so painful to even admit that they weren't welcome. So they created the myth that their names were changed because they didn't want to admit to themselves or to their children that they were being discriminated against. They filed the petitions for their names to be changed in order for them and their children to have a more secure future in America. But they didn't want people to know that that's why they changed their names. Okay, so that was like,
It's so interesting you say that because it brings me back to my childhood where my grandparents always told me that the names were changed because their name was too long.
Yeah, they got yeah, and you know what? I did a funeral this past Sunday for several members of our congregation's father, Stuart Sheldon's father, Eric Sheldon's father, Sam Sheldon. I don't know if you know Sam Sheldon. Anyway, their father was Arthur Sheldon, but I learned that he and his brother changed their name in college. Their name was like, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like Schluffrock. Their name was Schluffrock, and they changed it. The two brothers changed it to Sheldon, and the sons at the funeral were saying they should have just changed the name to Rock.
But it's interesting because nobody even flinched when I was a kid, telling all the my brother, myself, everyone else, like, oh no, the name was too long. That's why it was shortened.
Yeah, I'm sure every single one of us has the same thing. Like my mother's maiden name was Raffle, and we were always told, it was like Rafaletsky or something like that in Russia, and then Derechinsky was changed to Darrow, and it's supposedly from Ellis Island. Like they didn't speak English. They wrote an X right on their when they came in, and all those stories.
But how sad is it to think that they wanted to hide their identity to start new, that they weren't proud? Like I've always been a very, although quiet, a very proud Jew. I was very proud that amongst my New Jersey community, I was we used to joke around the token Jew because no one else was Jewish. My brother and I were like the only Jewish family. There was maybe one other. I was very proud of that, and it's sad to think that these families were trying to get away of their, so to speak, like their Jewish identity to start fresh. And they didn't want to have people focus on them and look at them as Jews.
But I think what's even sadder is, what Dara Horn is pointing out, that they wanted to hide the fact that that was the reason why they were changing their name. They were too embarrassed that they had come all the way to this country only to find that they were still being discriminated against here.
And then not telling your family either, your kids and
And then,
stuff.
I mean, even in the 80s, when I'm like a young kid, you're still telling me the same story that, oh, it was just too long of a name. We needed to.
Well, that's the story they were told. I'm sure they weren't lying to you. I'm sure that was, and you know what? I haven't proofed, I haven't gone and done my own research on Ellis Island. I'm only, taking what she's written at face value, because surely it goes against everything I ever learned as well about name changes at Ellis Island. But, what she's saying is 10 years after Ellis Island was closed, 65% of the petitioners were Jews having their names changed.
Well, they were it was difficult. I mean, I can go through my whole family, all the Russian names that I said, oh, thank God they changed them. I mean, really, how in the world these poor kids who to learn how to spell a last name, like some of them were, and it never came into the view that they were changed because they were Jewish names. They were Russian names. There wasn't anything that was Jewish about them. And I know that, I wonder, that's why I'm saying, she's looking at that. And I know there were some who would change it because they didn't want to appear as Jewish. But I don't know that that's a generality that she could make, that's why all these people changed their names.
Well, we do know that there were quotas in schools.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
And, that there were, I'm sure, people who didn't get job interviews or didn't get their resumes looked at. And I think that the majority of Russian immigrants, I'm assuming that the majority were Jews.
Right, yeah.
And so, it's just, it's painful. It's very
painful.
It
is. And I know that I had an uncle who was an engineer, and his name was Rosenstein, and he said he would never get a job if he used that name. So he changed it, and he took his first name and made that his last name, as Lester. And he says, you can call me Jay. And so he became Jay Lester. And that was never hidden, that the reason he changed it was because he wanted to work, and he would not have been able to work if his name were Rosenstein.
So, right, because he could have become Rosen or Stein.
Right.
But he chose Lester.
He chose Lester. Clearly. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, there's, you can look, as I said, there are two sides to everything. And that definitely was never hidden, that's why he changed his name.
So it's so interesting. This is all bringing up some stuff for me. Growing up, one of my best friends, her parents were German, and one day we're in high school and she calls me up and she's crying. She's like, I have to tell you something. And I said, okay. She's like, I just found out today my grandfather was a Nazi. And she was devastated, appalling, like crying, everything. And I understand if you don't want to be my best friend anymore. And I'm like, are you kidding? Of course, we're still best friends. Years go by. And from Ellis Island, my mother's maiden name was Fishbein Dagen. And I loved the name Dagen. I don't know why, loved it.
Wait, Fishbein what?
Dagen, Dagen.
Uh-huh.
And Dagen was taken off of the name. And years later, my best friend had her first baby and gave the middle name Dagen. to kind of say, here is my, I just got the chills. You kind of, as the life goes on, you kind of forget things, but she felt that it was important for her to do something to, I guess, kind of offset her grandfather and to say, like, I love you. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
yeah. So, we're going to wrap up because, I don't want to draw this out any further. I think that it's a very provocative book. I think it's an eye-opening book. I think it's disturbing. Her ultimate conclusion, you'll have to read for yourself, but she basically ends on this note by talking about how she becomes interested in Talmud. That, after immersing herself in all of this dead Jew business, that the way that she kind of infuses herself with life or re-inspires herself is by beginning to study Talmud, which is very life affirming and very much a way that you as a Jew today are in conversation with Jews of every generation that's passed, right? It's like when you study Talmud, you're conversing with Jews in the past. And that rather than honoring dead Jews, she's in conversation with those Jews who died. You know what I mean? And that's the way she's kind of come to terms with how she can affirm and honor the Jewish past rather than be dragged down by it. We have this concept in Jewish learning called nechemta. And nechemta is a note of comfort. So for example, when we have a haftarah that comes from a prophet who is just like haranguing his people, saying, you deceived God and you cheated and you stole and you lied and God's going to desert you. And then they always plug on like 2 lines at the end. But in the end, God will forgive you, right? There's always this nechemta. So that's the Jewish way, is that you have to end with a nechemta. And I think that is Dara Horn's nechemta, is that she tags on at the end of this book, this notion about being, really making it a priority as a Jew today to honor your Jewish identity and affirm it instead of just being defined by the way people try to murder Jews, right? And that is my point. I mean, just circling back to the very beginning of our conversation here this evening, I was appalled that over 60% of the books that I saw on the shelves were related to the Holocaust. Because what I want is for people to be excited and enriched by Jewish learning and by Jewish holidays and by Jewish living and Jewish texts, and not be thinking about, well, I'm going to be a proud Jew because of all those Jews who died. That's what makes my life meaningful, is all those Jews who died. I think the message we need to transmit is that Jewish life is meaningful because it's an enriching and beautiful and value-filled way to live your life, not because people died because they were Jewish. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember and never forget, as you said, Bobby, but it shouldn't be our defining character.
Exactly.
And so that's what I'm ending on.
Good ending.
I agree.
So I'm sticking with it. So that's the nechemta is, I think it's really important that we learn about what happened, but we not define ourselves by it, because that's letting other people define us. And we have to define who we are and what our mission is, and live proudly because of that and not because people died. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you read the
Thank
book.
you.
And
Thank
if you
you.
books to recommend, let me know.
Thank you, Craig, for being here, for recording it.
Appreciate it.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.